All right, well, welcome to the How to Draw Comics workshop. Uh, all right, great. Thanks, Tony. Thank you for letting me know that it is working. Great. Yeah, thanks for coming. So this is a presentation that I've done at conventions, but this is the first time I'm really doing it as a live stream thing. All right, so what I'm going to do is get you started. So for those of you who are just joining me for the first time, don't know who I am, I think you guys who are live know who I am, but for those of you in the studio audience who see this after it's been live, I'm Dirk Tiede. I'm the creator of Paradigm Shift, which is a werewolf detective story graphic novel series. And one of the things I just love drawing comics, and one of the things I love doing is sharing how I draw comics. And for those who aren't familiar with my work, this is some examples of the things that I draw. I love drawing backgrounds. I love drawing action. Action is so much fun. I love drawing, different settings. And of course, I'm heavily influenced by manga. But some of my early influences were actually Eastman and Laird, who drew the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They had the same sort of stuff going on in their comics that I like in manga. It's very cinematic. I hear that they were influenced very much by Frank Miller, and Frank Miller was way into Japanese movies and manga as well. Some of my manga influences include Masamune Shirow. It probably is very apparent if you see my comics. He was the first manga artist. I mean, I'd watched a lot of anime, but he was the first manga artist that I ever saw and read his comics, and it just seared into my mind. Again, the cinematic action. Kenichi Sonoda was also a huge influence on me. Again, mostly because of the action, the way he drew realistic things like cars and guns. I always liked that interplay, especially in classic manga, where they'd have these hyper-realistic backgrounds and then these like very simplified, cartoony, expressive characters. And that's one of the reasons why I draw manga style, and I love using it to tell my stories. Another big influence was Katsuhiro Otomo, who did Akira. Of course, I know now that all these manga artists had whole studios that worked with them, so it wasn't just one person producing all this work. But even so, it's hugely inspiring. And then I have to mention Miyazaki. I love his movies, but his manga work in Nausicaa is just breathtaking. He's quoted as saying that he doesn't think he's much of a manga artist, but I have to disagree. Of course, he's comparing himself to completely different people, but I mean, just look at this stuff. It's just amazing. And his storytelling is just, absolutely on the top of the heap. But you might not realize it, but one of my heroes is Scott McCloud, and the way he talked about storytelling in comics, in understanding comics, was one of the reasons I started drawing comics again. After drawing tons of comics in high school, I went off to college. I didn't draw comics at all in college, and I came out of college with this graphic design degree. I was working as a web designer, and I had a story in mind, but when I read Understanding Comics, I was like, oh, I have to do comics again. And the way Scott explained how concepts like this idea of the interplay between cartoony backgrounds or realistic backgrounds and cartoony characters, he called it masking, which I realized, oh, that's what's going on in manga and anime and animation, that you get this sense of a real place that then you can sort of envision yourself mapped onto that character. And that was a concept that Scott introduced. He also, the way he talked about the way panel interactions work, action to action, just the way panels interplay. That's the reason I love drawing comics. And I've got a whole other presentation on storytelling, which I will probably do in the next month. And we'll go into that in more detail, but Scott's work is highly influential. So if you haven't read Understanding Comics, I highly recommend it. So the process that I use for making comics that we're going to go over today is sort of a breakdown of not only how I draw the pages, but also I'll cover briefly the tools I'm using. We'll talk about character creation and drawing characters. I'll talk a little about story and script, because for me, if I didn't have a story, I wouldn't really be doing all these drawings. And as much as I'm an artist, I'm kind of a writer first. If I don't have my story, I'm not inspired to draw. I'll definitely talk about thumbnails and layouts and sort of the heart of comics, like that idea of putting images next to each other to tell a story. And then I'll talk a little about the actual process of drawing the finished pages, going from those thumbnails to pencils to doing inks and tones, making the grayscale and the turning the gray into screen tones. I'm not going to talk about coloring today, but I might do that in a future presentation. So when I first started out drawing comics, I was using entirely traditional tools, pencil and paper, and the first 3 books of Paradigm Shift, which are the now collected volume 1, was entirely drawn on paper using pencils and pen and ink. I used basically HB pencils. I used to use 2H pencils to do the roughs. I like these white vinyl erasers, like the Pentel Click Eraser. These Mars Staedtler things are really great for wiping out the whole line without leaving a lot of smears. I use Sakura microns a lot for backgrounds, although I have been known to use Pritagraphs as well, but the microns are a cheap alternative. They're less messy and hard, don't have to worry about cleaning them. And then the primary weapon in my arsenal was the Hunt 108 flexible crow quill nib. It's basically a crow quill that's made of copper, so it's really flexible. And then I also had a larger ink holder, which held other kinds of nibs, which I used for certain special effects, but I mostly used this Hunt 108. I'm using that a lot less these days, but for my first 3 books, that is the pen that I used. Nowadays, I'm doing most of my comics digitally. I'm using Clip Studio Paint as my primary art creation tool. I just did 2 workshops for mice on Clip Studio, including the drawing process for comics and then coloring and digital effects. So if you're interested in learning more about how Clip Studio works, you can check those out on the miceexpo.org website for this year's mice. Just go to the programming and look for the Clip Studio workshops. You can watch them for free on Crowdcast. And I went into a lot of depth about how I use Clip Studio to do my work. But I'm not going to cover specific techniques from that software today. I'm going to be talking about the general techniques that I use to create comics. Let's start with characters. So for me, having a comic is all about story, and you can't have a story without characters. And, I'm going to specifically talk about drawing characters, but in short, my concepts for my characters always come as an idea first. In the case of Kate and Mike as the main characters in Paradigm Shift, they were originally role-playing game characters that just sort of took on a life of their own in my head. And they went through a number of different iterations in terms of their designs. But if I'm starting with a brand new character, one of the things I have to think about first, beyond their personality, is what do they look like? Because obviously we're going to be drawing them over and over again. And something I've learned, I didn't start out with originally, but I think about now is the concept of a silhouette. How does the character look without any of the details? Like, what is their height, their width, what's their build? Are they tall? Are they short? Are they fat? Are they skinny? Are they muscly? Are they just, a beanpole? Are they completely not human? You can get a sense of these all being very different characters just by looking at the outlines. And the same goes for all the characters in Paradigm Shift. They all have a distinct outline, although it was not something that I originally planned, but when I look at the characters who are most successful, they're the ones that they have a distinct look to them, and that includes our beast characters too. So you can tell that they're not the same. So that's just something to think about. I mean, obviously, you can tell Batman immediately because of his pointy ears on top of his mask and that cape. You'll always be able to tell a Batman silhouette without being able to without seeing any of the details. Just or the same goes for Totoro. You could recognize Totoro anywhere. He's just a big round oval with the pointy cat-like ears on top. And that's Totoro. So let's talk about what I use to create my characters here. I basically use two different basic head shapes. For Kate and most of my female characters, I use sort of this anime seed shape to create their heads. And so you can kind of like create any direction the head is pointing just by drawing a kind of this seed shape here. And then for other characters, I have sort of more of this classical kind of American style comics, a semi-realistic head shape, which has a distinct jaw that comes down off of an oval. And the reason I use this is because you can kind of draw a character from any angle using this. And I'll switch over to demo mode here, so I can kind of give you an example of that. But say I want to, oops, give me a new layer. Here we are. So if I wanted to draw Kate, I could draw her from a number of different angles if I just use this same shape, just by creating this little cross. So I could have her looking at you, I could have her looking away, I could have her even looking to the side, just by using this basic shape. Now, of course, you have to add the details in, but just by having that little cross shape, you can show what direction a character is looking very quickly, and sort of to me, I'm imagining it's in 3D in my mind, and then I'm just putting down these rough lines to get a feel for where things are going. And the same goes for Mike, or any other character with that has a jaw. It's just you have to think about it a little bit more. There's a few more shapes involved, but the same idea holds. You have that cross that shows the directions people are facing. And yeah, here's some examples of Kate looking in different directions using that. So I use those two basic shapes to squish and squash and create different head shapes. So here are some other characters from Paradigm Shift. I got Frankie, he's got sort of a long skinny head. Here's Alfie, he's got a kind of a rounded features because he's kind of a chunky dude. And the Captain is also skinny, but long and thin, but he's got a distinct bump in his nose. He's got his chin is more defined, and so he doesn't quite have the same head shape as Frankie, even though I'm kind of stretching them in similar ways. JT here, he's got more defined cheekbones, a more defined chin. He's got a squarer face than Mike does, but I'm stretching that same basic shape. And then Gina, she's got that seed shape as well, just like Kate, but she ends up looking different because I've stretched her out. Kate has a little bit more heart-shaped face, a little bit. Gina's is not quite as much. It's very subtle, but she's clearly a distinct character. Another thing I do think about is I have done a lot of portraiture, as not only in taking figure drawing classes in college, but also as some of my illustration work. I had a client who I did lots of portraits for. So I try to think about real people's heads and faces when I'm drawing even my manga style characters. For instance, the captain here is actually based on the actor Gregory Hines. So I was looking at his facial features to come up with this character. So here's just a quick walkthrough of how you build out a character shape, a character head from those basic shapes. You add in the basic details over those basic head shapes, the seed shape, the realistic head shape, and then you build the details on top and then do the final drawing. So all the comic drawing, all the illustrations that I do, I'm working in layers like this. I'm not just, I mean, aside from when I'm doing like signings and books, or if I'm trying to do something really, really fast. In general, all my finished work comes from something simple that goes to more detailed. And that applies for the full figure as well. But just like with a face, you got to draw the human figure. Aside from lots of practice, the first thing you have to figure out is like, how do you get proportions working? And a lot of art books will show you the idea of breaking a figure into heads. So here's a head. The next head is sort of like across the chest. Oops. The next one is sort of at the belly button. The next one is down at the bottom of the hips. The next one is roughly at the knees, and the last head would be down at the bottom of the feet. So you can use that as a guide to kind of make sure your figures end up being roughly looking like they're human proportioned. There's some other things to keep in mind that this is sort of the quote-unquote ideal heroic proportions is 8 heads. Something that I've worked out that I've got my 2 characters, my male character, Mike, is taller than Kate, and what I've noticed from observation in real life is that the proportions with women and men vary a little bit. One thing I've noticed is that, this is not down to a person, but this is sort of a generalization. I found that women's torsos tend to be a little shorter than men's torsos, and that I think that has to do with the way body mass is distributed. But women have wider hips in comparison to their shoulders in general. So whereas if you look at Mike here, his hips actually line up with where his arms connect, whereas Kate's hips actually come out to sort of the middle point of her shoulders, even though she's kind of in a pose here, even if she was standing straight on. So if I were to draw that, so for a male proportions, you'd have the hips and the rib cage here, and they're more or less in line. We draw these extra points, but those are really just the muscles, the back muscles, and if somebody isn't like a athlete, those might not be very prominent. Whereas the female proportions would be slightly shorter, maybe even if the rib cage is so a little narrower, and the hips would be slightly wider. So they line up sort of like the midpoint of the shoulders as opposed to and also, a lot of times, a lot of comics will emphasize this hourglass shape. Again, what we're looking at there is not the actual shape of the rib cage, but rather the muscle definition in terms of the back. But in general, a lot of women's proportions tend to be a little more like this. They're not hourglass shaped. It's more like the rib cage just sort of comes up from the hips, like this. So that's something that you can use to create, even with people with different body shapes, you can play with that. Kate has something that's a little bit more of the hourglass, but she doesn't have a thin waist. What she has is more defined back muscles because she's a muscular and athletic build. That's not, it's not that she has a particularly thin waist. That's not what I'm aiming for, at least. So anyway, those are some things that I'm watching for when I'm building out a character. So underneath those details, here's the basic forms. I'm thinking about each of my characters. I have sort of this model in my mind of like an action figure. And each of the joints are sort of connected through, each of the joint I kind of think of as like a ball, even though they're not all ball joints. But if you ever played like an old G.I. Joe action figure, you'll know what I'm talking about, where the joints are they're distinct. And I'm kind of thinking of my characters the same way, as if they're an action figure. And I got this idea from animation artists, because this is how they break down any animated character to simplify the shapes, so it makes it easier for them to draw the motions and draw the in-between frames. But it's also similar to, there's the classic art posable figures, the wooden figures you can get. I'm thinking of it the same way, but it was explained in a book called Figure Drawing for, I guess it's just called Figure Drawing by Andrew Loomis, but he talks about the idea of this posable model that you have in your mind, and that you have to build it up by doing lots of drawings, but eventually each basically, I know this is what the lower limbs look like, this is what the upper limbs look like, so I can start thinking about how I'm drawing a character using some basic lines, and then I'll start filling out sort of these shapes that build up the figure. And then from there, I can go and start refining it. I can start putting in some bit of definition for muscles, joints, and feet. And this is what I'm doing, especially when I'm thumbnailing. I'm just doing these really quick, sketchy drawings to give me a figure for a sense of the figure. But I've got this idea of a posable figure in my mind, even like hands. I'm thinking of each joint as a separate object, basically. So it's something I've built up over practice, but if you look at any artist's work, or even if you look at a photograph, you can see how the body is built out of these basic pieces, and then you can build up an idea of them in your mind as you do more and more drawings. Once you've got that, you can lay in the more detailed anatomy over the top. And that's I'm not going to go into the details of that, but I highly recommend using some anatomy books to bolster how muscles connect together. It's one thing to look at other comic books. It's another thing to look at the masters and see what they're doing. But one of my first figure drawing books was another book called Figure Drawing by Joseph Shepard, and he was sort of one of the first artists I was looking at for basic figure drawing. I just did a quick demonstration, but this is using a picture from book 2 of how I would build up a moving figure. So the difference between drawing a character who's like straight on is that when you're drawing a character in motion, you have to really think about the lines that are making that character up. So in this case, to give Kate a sense that she's running away, she's actually just built up on a few simple lines here. And these are the rough pencils that I drew on that page. But they're made up of 3 basic lines. We've got this one line where where her arm is, and another line that swoops backwards that connects her body to her left leg, at least her left thigh. And then a third line, which is her right leg that's going forward. And this is something that I got from all the years of figure drawing I did in college. We did these 30-second gestural drawings when we'd first start out a class. And I remember just being so intimidated by that and not knowing, like, why are we doing that? But now I know, because I can put down a basic figure in under a minute, because I'm just looking at where these basic lines that make up the figure are. I'm not looking at all the details that make up the face. I'm not looking at the details that make up the hand. I'm looking at what are the big lines of motion that are defining the action of that pose. And then from those lines, I'm going to find other lines that kind of work together along with them. So I'm looking at lines that are sort of in parallel as I'm building up the shape. And, you know, I may physically draw these in, or I might just be thinking about them. So in the demo over here, so if I want to draw somebody running, so we'll draw, so I'll have sort of a couple of lines here for the arms, and then like another line for the head down through the back foot, and then another line for the hips. And so here in under 30 seconds, you've got essentially a running figure, and then you can start putting in the details, figuring out the proportions. I'm going very, very quickly, and I would have to do some cleanup on this to turn this into a final drawing, but the idea holds. You know, from those few lines, then you can get a lot of motion for a figure. So that's what I'm doing here. Again, once you've got that, those basic lines, then you can go in and figure out the basic forms, put in the anatomy, and then finish out. This would be the final pencils for that particular drawing. So, all right, so characters. You know how to draw characters. Perhaps you've now spent 5 years on it. But okay, so now you've got some characters, and now you want to make a story. So for me, there's a lot of cartoonists who jump right into drawing the story. I actually have always worked from an outline. These days I use some software called Scrivener, and this is the outline for the final script for Part 4 Flight. It's what's now collected in Volume 2 of Paradigm Shift. But these are all the scenes. I have them, they're like all written up in, like, have this note card format. But when I first wrote this, I actually was writing down all my ideas in notes on paper, and then I would transfer those ideas onto, at the time I wasn't using Scrivener. I picked up Scrivener about, I don't know, 2/3 of the way into drawing Part 4. And I was realizing, oh my God, I have to figure out how this story is working. But I found now that outlining really, really helps me, and that's what I'm using now to write Volume 3. And I started out by writing a rough outline here. It's essentially I started with sort of the main scenes. I knew there was some very important key scenes that were going to define the story, and then I try to figure out where all the leading elements are going to go from there. And from once I have an outline, then I can start writing a script. And I write my script in a screenplay format. So if you see here, this is a couple of pages out of Part 4. I don't write panel 1, panel 2. I just sort of write what happens. So this is the script for the example page I'll be showing. But what I'm mostly thinking is what is going to fit on the page. I found that basically on average about 6 panels are sort of the ideal for what will fit. Now you can go higher and you can go lower. Anything beyond 9 panels is gonna start getting really cramped, and I really only will do a page with lots and lots of panels on it if I'm trying to emphasize a point. And I'll do likewise if I'm using like 3 panels. I'm doing it because I'm trying to emphasize something in the story. But when I'm first writing the script, I kind of I'm going with like 6 actions. Kate sleeping, zoom in on a face, images, and then I've got the images listed, and then another final panel, and I can we'll go through the other one. But the idea is that for me, when I'm writing, it's like I'm tuning into this TV station in my mind's eye, and it moves too fast for me to draw. So it's easier for me to write the script of what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing the characters saying. And it's focused daydreaming is the way I kind of think about it when I'm writing. But when I'm in the right state, it's like I'm tuning into this TV station that is broadcasting the paradigm shift TV series, basically, and I'm just transcribing what's happening. Now, unfortunately, a lot of those ideas, they come into me out of order, so that's why I write an outline first, because I'll think of cool scenes that I want to have happen, and then I have to figure out how to tie all those scenes together. Oops. So usually this takes a few drafts. So I'm currently in the first draft of the scripts for Volume 3, and I'm going to finish out that first draft before I go back and do an editing pass on it. And I'm breaking it into issues so that'll make it a little easier to produce, but I want to make sure that I've got the whole story down, at least in a rough form, before I start drawing issue 1, because I don't want to have to make any major story changes later on, because I found that has gotten in my way before. And in part 4, I had an outline, and then the characters completely wildly deviated from that outline, in part because I was serializing it as a webcomic, and I had already published early scenes, and I couldn't go back and change them. So I kind of got caught. But now I've written a couple of other stories now, and I've used this revision process that works really well for me. And so using multiple drafts is helping me a lot. I also use a story outline using a method in a book called Rock Your Plot, which it's written for novelists, especially for novelists who aren't really firm with the idea of plotting. But it's a really useful way for me to look through and see how a story is working. I make a spreadsheet where I've got each scene, which characters are the important bits, who's my sort of main point of view characters, although sometimes I'll have multiple characters. I'm figuring out sort of where in the story are there. Is it the inciting incident is the thing that gets the story moving. There's other plot points along the way. There's another one called the Black Moment, which is where everything is really awful and it looks like everything is going to fall apart. And then I'm now thinking through the idea of the goal, the motivation, the conflict of each of characters, not only for the entire story, but for each scene. And then I love this idea that each scene, unless it's a resolution at the end of the book, has to end with some sort of disaster. And even if it's something as small as somebody just not getting what they want, or there's a great podcast called Writing Excuses that I've been listening to, and they've got a similar idea where every scene has to end up with a yes but or a no and. So the character sort of is always being propelled into the next thing. And I didn't have these tools in my toolbox when I wrote what became Volume 1 of Paradigm Shift, but I realized I was intuiting that. So it was almost like every page, every scene had to sort of have a mini cliffhanger. just to kind of propel you on to the next thing. It was always ending with a question. That was another way of me thinking through it. Anyway, so using something like this can help me juggle a story that is now as complex as Paradigm Shift is. I've been using a lot of tools like this, and I've spent the last couple of years learning some ideas from writers, especially novelists and screenwriters, to kind of figure out how to make my stories better. And once I've got that, then I make a final script, a final editing pass, and then I'm ready to start in the comics part. So for me, the heart of comics is the thumbnails. It's the basic layouts. It's that figuring out what images you put on a page to make a comic tell the story. Like, what happens when you put this image next to this image? This is one of the things I loved about Scott McCloud's work, is because he was thinking about how you can do this in lots of different ways. Now, I don't walk into a scene and say, oh, well, I'm going to do this through a series of action-to-action panels. No, although that's sort of my default. I'm going with how am I telling the story, but I do think about how do I vary up a page to make it look, so I can make it look how I want it to feel. And for me, the ideas are to just how do I turn that script and that story into images? So one of the first things that I do is look at that script and I come up with a panel layout. And once I've decided sort of what is the most important part of this page, am I going to make that how I'm going to emphasize that important thing? Is it going to be a big panel? Is it going to be a series of little panels? How do I get to my point? So in this this is an example from part 1, which is a fight scene. I had a panel layout. I knew what was going to happen in it, and then something I do is I literally draw arrows through my panels. Once I might have a very clear idea of what a panel is going to look like, the images in it, but if I don't, putting these little arrows in, they're sort of a shortcut for what is the eye flow for as the reader is going through the page. So I'll literally draw these little arrows, and then that gives me something to hook images onto. So from there, I'll draw. This is a simplified version of the thumbnails, but I'm looking for things that will follow these arrows, and so then you can literally see, all right, the eye comes in with this guy attacking Mike, and then the image stops with Mike literally having his hands up, and then you can kind of get pulled into the next panel by this guy's arm to a dialogue balloon, and then even this. The pool cue that he's attacking him with is also following that arrow. And then we get turned around as he's thrust this way across the page into the next panel. And then we're looped up here through a series of dialogue balloons and then down through this pool cue into this guy's face. And, it follows this rhythm. And so using that, and again, I'm kind of intuiting it. I'm not, I didn't analyze this like that when I was drawing this, but because I used those arrows, the composition kind of naturally ended up falling into this feel, and it worked. So I'll do a quick demo of how this works. So if I were to choose completely different. Now, if this were a totally live thing, we've got a delay in the live stream, so I would normally take this to the audience and come up with a quick character and scenario, but I'm going to just make one up here myself. So I'm going to have I'm going to be thinking of a scene that I just wrote recently, and I've got Kate sneaking back into her old apartment. So let's see. Let's draw those arrows real quick. So I've already got an idea for this first panel. So I'm going to show an alleyway. And I'm going to show Kate here looking up at the fire escape. She's got to get up to that fire escape because she needs to climb back into her building. She doesn't have the keys anymore. And she wants to get there undetected. So, all right, so I'm going to follow that. So now I've got this arrow going up, so she's going to run and grab, run and jump. Let's see. I want her to come this way. Let's see, what would be the best way to do this? Ah, I know. I'm going to change the camera angle. No. Probably thinking through this a little bit too. All right, we're just going to have her run. One of the things I love about digital is you can move things around really easily. So I'll just have her run in that panel, and then I'll just have her do like a mega jump. Trying to think of what the best angle would be for this scene, so I can actually see what's going on. I picked a hard one. Oh, I know. Going to be on the fire escape here, and she's going to land like this, kind of superhero style. And what I'll do is have like a couple of versions of her jumping up and flipping around. Maybe she's coming off the page here. Doing a tuck and flip, and then landing. And I might move that around a little bit, but anyway, you kind of get the idea that when I'm laying out a story, this is sort of the heart of comics right here. Everything else beyond this is illustration. And you can apply all sorts of great skills to doing the illustration, but it's this deciding about what you're going to put into a panel in this stage. And the quicker you can get at just getting ideas down on the page, the more likely you're going to be able to do lots of comics. And, you know, it doesn't matter if your style is very realistic or manga or stick figures or whatever. This is where the heartbeat is. Everything that's going to come after this, and yeah, technically I only got 15 minutes, but you know, I can go longer than noon. But for me, what I'm doing now is, it used to be that I would agonize over a single page a lot, and because I was doing a webcomic, I would sort of like be retreading these steps a lot. Sometimes I'd know exactly what I want and a page would go really quickly. But if I got stuck, I'd be like redoing this part over and over and over again before I could get to that point where, all right, I know what I want, and then I can go and put all those fun details and ink it and all that. But this is, I've found, what I prefer to do now is to work on lots of scenes and work on lots of pages all at once, and basically do the thumbnail process on a whole scene at a time, and then I can like just do a stick figure version of a scene like this in an afternoon maybe, and then I can come back later, because what I plan to do with volume 3 is I'm gonna do the thumbnails for an entire issue first, and then I'll go back and start doing the pencils, and I can edit it as I go, and then before I move on to the next issue. And that's kind of what I did to finish out volume 4, is that volume 2, part 4, that I did this to do the last half of the book, and it was really, really useful. So looking at it, we'll just do a quick walkthrough for the example page. Here's the script. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 panels roughly, and I don't put the panel numbers in because sometimes I'll change this when I go to the thumbnails. I'll realize, oh, what works on the page in a script doesn't quite work on the page for a thumbnail. In this case, this one worked pretty well. So here's the script. So the first thing I decided to do is, how am I going to break up those panels? I know I like wide panels because they remind me of movies. And I think of like wide panels almost as either like a movie shot or like a pan going right to left across, like on film. And I like vertical panels because they can either feel like a really quick cut, like it's a really quick motion, like thing to thing to thing to thing, or it can look like, especially for a larger one, like you're doing a vertical pan going up or down on the screen. And so I'm thinking about that when I do the layout. I look at my script, and then I come up with a panel layout. And I also think about what is going to be the most important part of this shot. And in this case, I decided this panel where Kate is awake and looking at another test subject transforming, that was sort of going to be the highlight panel of the page. So here we go. I lay in my arrows here, and then I do the drawings over those arrows, kind of roughly following them. In this case, I didn't follow this arrow precisely, but I do have this idea of the up and down kind of motion. And here it's like her face doesn't follow this, but it does have that kind of curve to it. Looking over and seeing the other test subject, and then reacting. And here I've built this character right in on that turn. For these wide panels, I'm using sort of like these S turns. Oops. There we go. And then we turn around. So then, once I've got that, I mean, at this point, these thumbnails are almost as good enough to be roughs, but this is not a example of a finished thumbnail, although sometimes I will go back and outline all the major stuff. I didn't originally on this page, but I did do this for the book to outline the basic shapes, because once you've got your thumbnail, what you're looking for is the major iconic images. Like, can you read it? Is it simple enough to be read without all the details? And if you can read what's going on, even if it's really small, and then you know that you're in a good place. Also, another good rule of thumb for me is if you can tell roughly what's going on without reading any words on the page, you're in the right ballpark for a comic page. That was one of my early rules. Sometimes I break it because I'll have like really, really wordy scenes, but in general, I try to like at least convey the feelings through just those images. So as I said, I now thumbnail entire scenes ahead. So here is an example of thumbnails of the big climax of Volume 2, big werewolf fight. And you can kind of see what's going on just from the layouts, but just doing this ahead of time before I go back and draw it, I'm actually saving myself a lot of time because I can let myself think about what I've put down in the back of my mind before I come back to it, and then I can edit it when I'm doing the final pass. So what does that final pass look like? Again, just like at the beginning when I was showing you drawing characters, I'm working in layers. So if I were drawing this on paper, sometimes what I would do is I would do the thumbnails in the sketchbook, and then I would do a new layout on a piece of paper and then look at my thumbnail and just basically redraw it big. Sometimes I would literally scan my thumbnails into Photoshop, print them up really big on a 11 by 17 and paper, and then use a light box to transfer that to the Bristol board that I use. Nowadays I'm using Clip Studio. The thumbnails are just on a layer below, and then I make a new layer or several new layers to create the final artwork. So here I've got an example page. So here's our example page. Here are the thumbnails. I'll switch everything so it's blue before I go and start on the roughs. So these are sort of the rough pencils. And if there's something that's already fairly detailed within the thumbnails, I won't really need to go back and do roughs over the top. This panel in here, we'll talk about that panel, but that's probably better covered in the backgrounds bit. But once I've got some roughs, so this part is sort of equivalent to what I was doing with those sketchy things in the demo over here. So then I'm going back over and like adding the basic details and fleshing out the characters. And then once I've got that, then I can go over it and do a final pencil pass, especially if it's a more detailed scene. Like this has got all these hospital beds and and this crazy background here. The those are the types of things that I'm mostly doing pencils for. I mean, I do want to clean up the anatomy on the characters though, so that's another reason I'll be doing that. I do pencils. So then once that's done, I will back these off into, say, I just changed the opacity on the layer folders so you can see things a little bit more clearly, and then I'll go back over and do inks over the top. Since it's 11:55, I'm not going to get into the intricacies of inking, but suffice to say, what I'm doing digitally, I created this, I call it textured pen. It's based on the basic G pen nib that comes with Clip Studio, but I gave it a rough texture. Let's see. It's got this, it's got this textured pen thing, so it doesnend create a completely smooth line. So I'm trying to mimic what I was doing on paper. And I've also found that I tend to keep everything at 30. I'm working at 600 dpi for an 11 by 17 page. And so I found that the two settings that work best for me are 30 pixels and 20 pixels. So 30 pixels is more for outlines and the big fat lines, and 20 pixels is more for the details, and it will go all the way down to a thin line, but then it'll also fatten up. And just switching between those two variations gives me enough to work with. I build out each of the characters. The characters are on their own layer. The borders are on their own layer. The word balloons are on their own layer. The special effects are on their own layer. And this is really helpful for me for later if when I go back and shade things. I can select things and have it ignore certain layers if I don't want them. I should do a real inking demo at some point just to kind of give a feel, but couple of things I'm thinking about when I'm inking. I vary the line weight, so thin lines, thick lines. One of the things that I use to determine what's thin and what's thick, I kind of think where the light source is. So if the light's coming from this direction, then all of the lines on a character facing the light are going to be thinner than the lines that are facing away from the light. That kind of helps gives the character some shape. You know, it's the sort of thing that has been built up over time that I've observed what I liked in other artists. Another thing I'll do is I'll put out thicker outlines around objects than the details within. It's another thing that helps give some depth to a drawing. But varying line weight is just sort of the key. Let's see. Go back to my presentation. Pencils. Don't have time for the backgrounds. We're kind of running out of time here, but I'll just give you a kind of quick walkthrough of how I built this panel. So first up, the basic principle of perspective is that all parallel lines converge someplace on the horizon. So if you're looking at anything like train tracks or a row of beds, everything that goes away into the distance is going to look like it's converging. So even when I'm doing my thumbnails, I'm keeping that principle in mind while I'm drawing. Another thing I'll do when I'm trying to draw a very specific background, I'll go look up references, so I can see what the details of like a hospital bed looks like. I'll often use 3D models to help me. I use SketchUp almost exclusively as my 3D modeler of choice. It used to be free. It's not free. There's a web version that's free, but I've now purchased the desktop software because I use it so much. And it's got a really great library of free models that are free to use with certain restrictions, but for doing what I'm doing with comics, that's perfectly within the license. So those are really great for things like guns. There's a lot of people who have built free models for that, which is really helpful because it's a lot faster than doing them by hand. Like I can do them by hand, but they just take longer. So once I know what I'm shooting for to turn this thumbnail into a final drawing, first thing I'm going to do is figure out where my vanishing points are, and I do that by like reverse engineering the lines that are already in my rough drawing here. So the first vanishing point is going to be like over here. This is some of the oh yeah, here we go. And the other vanishing point is going to be like somewhere over there. Clip Studio's got a really great tool for this, but even if I were doing it on paper, I would just pull out a ruler and draw, just extend those lines out and figure out where they match. So here on the page, this is where those vanishing points were. So in the case of this axis, they're like way off the page. And if I were doing this on paper, what I would have to do is tape pieces of paper to the back of this sheet to find that vanishing point and use a nice long ruler, which I have like a 36-inch ruler now. So, you know, it is entirely possible. But doing something this detailed with a ruler does take time. I mean, you just, it was much faster to do this digitally. So once I figure out the vanishing points, I go in and lay in the details for each of these beds. And all this mess here on the floor is just me figuring out the way the tile floor works. There's a principle you can use diagonals to figure out where the halfway point is. So each of these, you can kind of see it. Can I draw on this? Let's see. If I were to draw pink. Nope, that didn't work. All right, I guess I can't mark this thing up right now. Bummer. No, wait, maybe I can. Let's see. So, oh. Yeah, here we go. So yeah, like each of these boxes, let's see, from here to here to here, that's like a set of 4 tiles. And so this diagonal is this principle where you can, if you draw an X through anything, you can find, come on, draw. Let me draw. If you draw an X through from corner to corner, you figure out where the halfway point is. So that allowed me to find all those tiles on the ground. So let's see. If I could jump to the inked version, yeah. So you can see that's how I created all those repeating tiles. It looks really complicated, but it's a simple principle. It just takes a little bit of time to pull it off. Then, anyway, we're skipping ahead. We're at 12:03. But let me wrap this up. Let's just talk about how the screen tones work. So one of the looks that I was specifically going for in Paradigm Shift is to look like old school manga. And one of the things that makes old manga look like manga is the zipatone, those little tiny round dots that make up the gray tones. And in the first books, what I would do, well, in all the books, what I use is I just use grayscale layers. I used it in Photoshop originally, but now that I'm doing it in Clip Studio, I'm literally just picking from a couple of gray tones. I use 10% gray, 20% gray, 40% gray, 60% gray, 85% gray, and black. So I'm using 5 shades of gray that are just far apart enough that if you put 2 of them next to each other, you can actually tell the difference. Although I tend to not do anything, so I never put 2 grays together that are less than twice, less than double, basically. So the way I've worked it out, it doesn't. I never have basically grays that are going to be totally muddy. I do put in gradients, so those like here will give it a feel. But what I would do in Photoshop is just lay in my grays. I just have a couple of basic layers. I've got my base tones, which is the vast majority of them, and then I put the gradients on a separate layer. In this case, there's really only the one. I guess there's 2. And then I have another layer which is called etching, and this is basically whiteout. And so what it is just going and knocking stuff out. In the original traditional manga, when they'd use zipatone, what they'd do is take an X-Acto knife and actually scratch part of it off to create little kind of white line effects. And so that's what I'm doing with an extra layer here. I didn't do a whole lot of that on this page, but it works. And then in Photoshop, I would actually have to convert that whole grayscale layer. I'd basically copy the whole page onto a new file and then convert from grayscale to bitmap. And then I would have to tell it I want round dots at 45-degree angles at 75 lines per inch, and it would spit out the file, and I could print that. However, these days in Clip Studio, it does it automatically. There's this feature here under the layer properties that will automatically do your screen tones. And these days, what I output for the new volumes, I used circles, 45 degrees at 53 lines per inch. It produces a nice coarse screen tone that's easy to see, prints really well, and I just love the look of it. And it gives it that old school manga look, and it's also coarse enough to be read on the web. And working on a new website, which I'll be rerunning the entire story from the beginning, and it'll be featuring these nice upgraded versions of the pages. So by using that setting, I can even mimic that look on the web, which I wasn't able to do before, and that's why the pages always were just grayscale online. So yeah, that pretty much wraps up what I'm doing, how I'm building these pages, how I'm thinking through my comics. I will be doing future workshops delving into various specific things that I covered, like a backgrounds, one on backgrounds. I'm going to be doing one on like figure drawing and character work. I've got one on storytelling that really delves into the idea of comic storytelling. And I'm going to be doing a number of these workshops, maybe not between now and Christmas, but as time goes on, I'm going to be doing more of these live versions. So I hope you'll join me for that. And if you haven't already checked out Paradigm Shift, please do at paradigmshiftmanga.com. You can also sign up for my mailing list there. If you go to the Paradigm Shift Manga Facebook page, you can hit sign up for my mailing list, and you'll know when my next workshop is going to be. And please check out the books, check out the comic, and if you're really interested in knowing more about this process of how I draw comics, and you want to basically know some of the behind-the-scenes stuff behind creating Paradigm Shift, check out The Art of Paradigm Shift. It's an art book. It has a whole section in the back going through this process that I worked with you today. So thank you for joining me, and I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you all again soon. So thanks a lot, and bye-bye.